Good evening. We start from part of the seminar today, and as you know, this seminar is basically about the ideas about score in an academic environment. Now we have a very important part of the seminar, is the Forlin lecture. But who was Franco? Franco was not a scholar, but he was, for me, in my opinion, much more of a scholar because he was a freedom lover. He was from Turin, and when he was young, university studied economics under Sergio Costa, and Sergio Costa was the best classical liberal economist from Italy in the second part of the 20th century. And Franco, after his studies, became an entrepreneur. He created a company, and this company never became a big company. But in spite of it, since the beginning, since 2004, Franco supported IBL, Istituto Leoni, in a very generous way. Immediately, it became one of the pillars of the Institute, and it gave us much more than part of his money. He gave us time, he gave us attention. And he strongly believed in our idea of an intellectual defense of property rights, free market, individual liberty, and so on. And as you know, in every relationship, there is a kind of exchange. And Franco, in my opinion, invested a lot in IBL, in exchange of what? In exchange, I think, of satisfaction to see younger people writing papers and diffusing ideas in defense of freedom. Franco was really a very generous man. And if IBL is based, even today, Turin is, yes, because Leoni was from Turin, but also, and above all, because Franco. Because, you know, every intellectual enterprise needs some elements. Economic resources, obviously, ideas and vision, but also organization. And if IBL has been, and it is, a quite successful story, it is largely because of Franco. And because Franco took care of all of the details of our organization. In this way, Franco gave the opportunity to an adventure imagined by young people who never managed a company to become a real institute, well-established, seriously conceived, with a clear division of tasks, charges, and responsibility. So IBL people are all very grateful to Franco and his family for many reasons. And one of these reasons is his teachings and his spirit, because he was always positive, smiling, never envious. I was really surprised to see a successful man as Franco, really full of admiration for young people, even 40 years younger, happy that his values could find a consistent defense. And this way, Franco gave us a lot. But above all, his commitment to our ideas, his friendship, his example. Thank you very much, Frank.
Welcome among us, Chandras Kukathas. Chandras Kukathas is political head of the Department of Government at the London School of Economics. Is an old friend of Istituto Bruno Leoni, which has sponsored the publication, the translation of the liberal, of his book, The Liberal Archipelago, with Libri publisher a few years ago. Chandran is a strong defender of multiculturalism, and the Liberal Archipelago is a strong defense of multiculturalism, and so to say, of toleration. Think tanks as Istituto Bruno Leoni quite commonly seem far and uninterested by freedoms not immediately belonging to our economy. Or maybe they feel a sort of discomfort in dealing with too much big problems as immigration, integration, balance between security and freedoms, pluralism, and so on. Professor Kukathas has not saved his energy in deeply reflect on these points and on what is the primary challenge of our contemporary world. It is maintaining the promise of a free and open society without renouncing to peace, order, security, and identity. That's why we asked Professor Kukathas to dedicate to immigration and freedom the Forlin lecture, and I will leave the floor saying before to you that after the lecture there is, and before the dinner, there is a little drink upstairs. Thank you.
Can you hear me through the microphone clearly? Well, firstly, let me thank my hosts for the very kind invitation. It's a great honor to be here, and thank you all for coming. My topic today is immigration and freedom, and as you just heard, this is a topic that is very much a question for our time. So this is subject also of a book that I'm writing called Immigration and Freedom. Often when one writes a book, one must finish it quickly before the issue disappears, but I don't think this is going to happen. The title of the book is Immigration and Freedom, very deliberately, because what I want to do in this book and in this lecture is talk about the question of freedom. And this is a word you don't often hear in discussions of immigration, except to the extent that people sometimes say we need to slow or stop or prevent, control immigration in order to protect our values. And Europe, people often say the value is freedom. What I want to say in this lecture, and this is the main message of the lecture, is that immigration control poses a threat to freedom. And it poses a threat not to the freedom of immigrants or would-be immigrants, but it poses a threat to citizens and residents in their own countries. This is the basic message of the book and of my lecture. And what I hope to do in the next 45 minutes is persuade you of this, not to persuade that everything is going to go into disaster the moment we start slowing our obsession with controlling immigration. But I do want to say that there are unintended consequences that we need to be aware of. Now, I'll start with a quotation from the Swiss writer Max Frisch, who said, "We asked for workers and got people instead." And the point of this here is to say that when you're thinking about immigration, it's very, very tempting simply to think in economic terms, to think about the movement of labor, to think about the movement of factors of production. And what I want to say is, actually, we're talking about human beings. Now, this is not just because human beings have rights that ought to be recognized, or this is important too, But it's important also to realize that human beings, as human beings, don't come to us, into the world, don't live in the world in isolation. They come with a lot of baggage. Their family, their friends, their relations of all kinds, they have associations, they have workers themselves, they have employers. They come with a full collection of relationships. And those who want to control immigration often forget this, as if they think you can simply move people from one place to another, to quote Adam Smith, like pieces on a chessboard. And I want to say we need to get away from thinking in these terms. And thinking about immigration in terms of freedom is perhaps a crucial part of this. Now, in order to understand this, we need to understand a few different things. Firstly, we need to understand what immigration might mean. And this also means understanding what borders are. It means understanding why it is that immigration control does pose danger to freedom, and also why it poses danger to equality, very important value for liberals, because all citizens should be regarded as equal before the law, and it poses a danger to the rule of law itself. So the first half of my lecture is going to be concerned with explaining what immigration means, why it's a worry for freedom, why it's a worry with respect to equality and the rule of law. In the second half, I'll consider some objections to this view, coming from those who might want to say, well, even if it is a danger to freedom, well, maybe it's worth it nonetheless. Maybe there are economic reasons we should be keen to control immigration. Or perhaps there are cultural reasons. Or perhaps there are reasons of self-determination. And what I want to suggest is that these reasons don't really stand up. They don't really give us reason to think more carefully and critically about immigration control and the danger it poses to freedom. So let me start with the question of definition, because this is something that's often avoided and neglected. Firstly, many countries, including the United Kingdom, don't actually have a definition of immigrant or immigration, even though they have policies concerning this. The British government, for example, had a policy, now abandoned, of reducing net migration to the UK to 100,000 people a year or fewer. Net migration refers to the difference between the number of people entering the country as immigrants and the number of people leaving the country or emigrating. But all of this without having a definition of immigrant. The only category the UK has is a category of people with a right of abode. So strictly speaking, someone from the EU, at least until Brexit, who moves to Britain is not an immigrant. All the people moving from Romania to London are not immigrants because they have a right of abode. So how are we going to define immigrants? Well, UN defines an immigrant as someone who's moved to a country not of their own nationality to live elsewhere for a year. So if you're there for 364 days, you're not an immigrant. And if you live there for 365, you are. So here's one way we can slash immigration overnight. We'll say you're not an immigrant unless you stay for 2 years. This would really cut down immigration so massively without any cost. Or we can increase immigration by saying anyone who comes in as a tourist is an immigrant. If that's the case, in the United States in 2013, there were 362 million immigrants who moved into the country, because that's how many people crossed the border that year. So this tells you something. Immigration is something that does not rely on definitions that identify natural kinds. There's no such thing as an immigrant as a natural thing. An immigrant is a category that's part of a legal definition. And that definition is arbitrary, and it can change, and it does change all the time. Now, the same thing is true for borders. What is a border? Well, for much of the discussion of immigration, people talk about the border as if it's simply a line that's crossed. But immigration is not about crossing a border. If that's the case, as I said, that there would be 362 million immigrants into the United States, excluding illegal and unknown immigrants. So crossing the border is not the crucial thing. The question is, what kinds of rights do you have once you cross the border? You have the right to stay. You have the right to reside. You have the right to get a job. You have the right to become a student, or to teach, or to set up a business. These are the things that immigration control largely determines. Of course, it affects whether you can cross the border, but since most countries, especially in the developed West, want to have people come in as tourists in particular, hotels to be full, even if they want the neighborhoods to be very quiet, most countries want people to come in. So if we're going to think about what immigration control is, we've got to recognize that it's not about stopping border crossing, it's about controlling what people do. And that means that if you want to think about borders and the openness of the borders, you've got to think a little bit more carefully about what this actually means. Doesn't this mean entry? On the other hand, it doesn't mean citizenship or membership either, because many people who migrate don't become citizens. I'm a resident in the United Kingdom, have been for 9 years. I'm not a citizen. I became eligible to become a citizen last year. I have not taken up this right yet, though I probably will. But many people don't. In Australia, the government encourages people who become residents to become citizens. And most people do, except for the British. The British who move to Australia don't like to become Australian citizens. Probably because of their cricket and football. So, we're not talking about membership. We're not talking about entry. We're talking about a combination of these things. In fact, we're talking also about the extent to which people have the right to participate in a society. So the openness of a society to immigration is really a matter of these three things in combination. And you can see that, you can think about a country along a number of different dimensions, therefore. You can think about a country and ask, does it allow for entry into the society? Does it allow participation, for example, in the labor market? And does it allow membership? A country could have very open borders because it says yes on all three. It could have very closed borders because it says no on all three. But it could also have a combination. It might say, yes, you can enter, yes, you can participate, but you can't become a citizen. Or it could say, yes, you can enter, but no, you can't work, and no, you can't become a citizen. Here are the 8 logical combinations, 8 logical possibilities. So the openness of a society to immigration is a matter of some combination of these things. And you can make a society, therefore, more open to immigration without admitting one more citizen. You can also make it more open by making it easier on each of these categories. Easier to enter, easier to participate, easier to become a member. Think of it in these cases. Okay? Imagine 3 countries, A, B, and C. Not a very imaginative name, never mind. So you can imagine a country that has very, very easy entry. You can become as a tourist without any difficulty. Britain is a bit like that. You don't need a visa to come to Britain for most countries. In some countries you do, but most countries you don't need one. Whereas in the United States, very few countries aren't subject to a visa requirement. Well, maybe it's easier to come in, but it's very hard to get permission to work. And maybe very, very difficult to actually become a citizen. You could imagine a country where it's very difficult to get in, and even more difficult to get work. But once you've actually been allowed in and allowed to work, well, they make it very easy for you to become a citizen. Or you could imagine a place that's very, very difficult to enter in the first place. Once you enter, it's difficult to get the right, or it's easy to get the right to work, but still very hard to get membership. Well, that means that if you're going to make the borders more open, you can do so just by making it easier in any of these categories without admitting a single more person. And my point here is simply to say immigration control is not just about how many people enter. It's about what they can do, how easy it is for them to do what they want to do most of the time, which is from the to work, to study, to train, to do business, maybe to fall in love, maybe to marry, to do all kinds of things. You can make all of these things easier and thereby make the country much more a country of open borders without admitting a single more person. Now, this then brings me to my main theme. Why would we care about this? Well, one reason we might care about this, of course, is that we care about the rest of the world. We care about the fact that there may be people who want to exercise their freedom to move, to travel, to visit, and perhaps to take up work, to marry someone they've fallen in love with, or set up a business where they see an opportunity. And national boundaries seem like artificial and unnecessary barriers. But I'm going to put that question aside and say there's another reason we should be concerned about this. Not from the perspective of our concern for people out there, for the foreign, but from the perspective of our own interest and of our own freedom in particular. Why is this so? Well, mainly because immigration control, as I've already suggested, is about controlling people. It's about controlling what they do. It's about controlling them by limiting the rights that they have. But you can't control some people without controlling almost everyone. That's the problem. You can't control outsiders without controlling insiders. If you want to control immigrants and would-be immigrants by restricting their ability to work, to study, to set up business, to trade, to marry, all of these things, your problem is your fellow citizens and residents aren't going to cooperate for the most part. They will marry them, whether you like it or not. They will give them work. They will trade with them. They will do business. They will admit them to university. They will do all kinds of things because, in the end, relationships between people are human relationships. They're not relationships among factors of production. They're not relations among political aims. They're relations among people. So if you want to control the outsiders, you have to control the insiders. You're going to have to regulate them. You're going to have to monitor them. You're going to have to punish them when they break the rules. 3 years ago, the British government shut down part of London Metropolitan University. The reason for this was that London Metropolitan University had not been adequately monitoring its overseas, and therefore all its students, to make sure that they were compliant with all the visa requirements. The result of this was that many students had their courses abandoned. Many of them had moved to other universities. Many of them simply had to abandon their studies altogether. Many lecturers now found that they did not have jobs because of this astounding statement by the government. Now, the government was doing this because it was trying to control not its own citizens in the first instance, but people they regarded as potential immigrants. But they could not do that directly. They could only do that by imposing on the university a requirement that they register, monitor, regulate, control their students, and then report back to the Home Office. And the Home Office, in turn, monitored them. And when they failed with their compliant students, everything went bad. This is just one example that's familiar to people in the university. But you can imagine this is a story that's familiar to any employer. It's familiar to any person trying to engage in trade. It's familiar to anyone who's trying to get someone they want to marry a visa in order to either come to the country or stay in the country. They will have to be subject to these controls. To give you another very simple example, very, very common, I mean, there are hundreds and thousands of these. One of my colleagues is Albanian. Her husband is British, 2 children were born in London. She invited her mother from Albania to come to London to spend a few weeks with their new baby. But the visa was denied on the grounds that in the application, when they explained why her mother would be coming, she said, well, to play, visit, look after the children. The Home Office said, well, that means you're looking for employment, which is not permitted. So her mother cannot come to visit her grandchildren, her English grandchildren, because this would put her in violation of labor law. These are laws, of course, designed to keep out employment, keep out employees potentially, and supposedly protect the British labour market. Leah did not instead go off to hire a nanny immediately. She didn't want a nanny, she wanted a mother. So the freedom of ordinary people are impacted in these ways continuously. I mean, as I said, this is not an isolated case. And it's also true in the United States, for example. If you're going there to visit a daughter or a son and play with your grandchildren, don't say anything about helping around the house. In fact, when you go there, I think this is a very good reason to say to your son or daughter, sorry, I can't help with the dishes, because, I can do water. Here's an analogy, actually, that's surprisingly close to home. This is the apartheid analogy. South Africa set up a system of controls to prevent black people from associating with white people and to keep them separate from white society. This policy had its origins in the late 19th century, but it began really in the post-war years with all the seriousness. The purpose of the policy was to keep black people in separate development. But the problem was they also needed the labor supply. In order to maintain that labor supply, they had to have people reasonably close by, but even then it was inconvenient. So in the end, they had to allow black members of the society to come and live in white areas. But in order to enforce the separation, they needed two things. Firstly, they needed them to monitor, which meant monitoring their own citizens. Eventually, although initially only blacks were subject to the pass laws and to show their papers whenever they moved, eventually whites were subject to very, very similar sorts of controls. But the other thing they had to do was they had to develop an ideology of apartheid to say, this is the way things ought to be. That control eventually led to a system of controls on whites that was much more extensive through the limitation of access to the courts and through the development of a much stronger police presence, much stronger control on publications and on newspapers, and eventually controls on everybody. This is a necessary part of social control. If you're going to control some people, you end up controlling everyone. Here's what Mr. Cameron had to say, almost as if to make my point for me that he was talking about recently. He said, we're going to have to make it harder for these people to come to Britain, to make it less attractive. And he said, since I became Prime Minister, we've made it harder to get a driving license, to a bank account, to get a council house, and we've removed more people through deportation. We're controlling the internal borders. So that's my point. The borders are not outside or on the margin, they're inside. And if you try to make it harder for immigrants to get a license, to get a bank account, to get a house, you're making it harder for everybody. I can say this as someone who's the warden of our university residence. Every university set up a social committee, which has a president and a treasurer and a secretary. And the treasurer has to manage the students' finances. But the problem is, foreign students aren't eligible to have the kind of bank account that allows them to do this. So we're always struggling because in an international institution like the LSE, we often can't run a social committee because of attempts to control foreigners. Employment regulation, education, they're all areas in which we find more and more extensive controls on people in order to achieve the ends of immigration control. These are controls, as I said, not just on outsiders, but they're controls on citizens themselves. The ideology of apartheid is perhaps an extreme version of this. But the reason for pointing to this particular example is that not so much that we can see there's something racist about this, that's not my point at all. The point is that you will start off trying to control black, you end up controlling white. In fact, you can't make that distinction. It's not a legal distinction from the point of view of control. You either control or you don't control. If you want to subject yourself to control, immigration control is one way of going about this. So, my fundamental point is about the impact of immigration control on freedom. But let me turn from this and just say a little bit about why it means not just a loss of freedom, but a loss of other important values, values which are, in a sense, for the sustaining of any kind of free society. These are the values of equality and rule of law. Why do these things come in danger? Well, the first thing to understand here is that immigration control in a free society, liberal democratic society, is going to be something that can only be conducted through the processes of law. Because you cannot simply pick someone up arbitrarily and deal with him or her without giving them the full benefit of the law. But the problem that whenever you try to engage policy with a particular goal as an outcome is that the law then becomes not so much something that enables this as something that is also an obstacle to this. If you set yourself a target of deporting so many people, for example, or reducing the numbers of people who are entering the country, or target of a net migration rate of so many hundred thousands a year, you will have to manage this through all the legal and institutional processes that govern the lives of everybody in that society. And that means that we may not be able to achieve that end. Mr. Trump has suggested this. Since there are 12 million illegal immigrants in the United States, we need a more extensive policy of deportation. When he becomes president, this is what he will do immediately. He will deport those 12 million people. Well, right now the US has the capacity legally, through its institutions of deportation, to deport 400,000 people a year. So do the maths. You've got 12 million, and you can do 400,000 a year. In 10 years, you're not even going to be halfway. Mr. Trump will have 8 years if he was elected twice. So he's going to have to ratchet up the number of not just enforcement officials, but also the number of people who are dealing with these issues through the bureaucracy and through the courts. You could increase the number of civil servants without too much difficulty. It would be a costly thing. But it's not all that easy suddenly to create courts that can deal with an extra, in a single year, an extra 11.5 million cases. It's simply not going to be the case. That's assuming that no deportable illegal immigrants come into the country in that period. So, what do? Well, what governments typically do is they then try to find a way around the law. And there's a long history of this. And in a certain sense, just as the movement of people is the result of supply and demand, any attempt to control markets by restricting the movement of goods is going to create other routes whereby these things happen. The same is true of governments. If they've got a policy and they can't achieve it through legal means, they will find other ways. And this is what, for example, in the United States has been happening for a very long time, at different levels, different stages. Did you know that between 1940 and 2000, the United States deported 1 million American citizens? By mistake, of course. You can't deport a citizen legally. But in an attempt to get around the law, in order to deport people they thought was undesirable, they deported 1 million of their own people. They did this because they engaged in sweeps and went through neighborhoods, picked up people who looked like they were Mexicans, and sent them off. If they didn't have papers, well, that proved that they were illegal. But of course, if you're a citizen, why would you have any papers? You were born in a place, haven't got a passport, you're not traveling, you wouldn't need any papers. But if you look Mexican, well, the assumption is you should have papers. A million citizens. So this is my point. Immigration control is control, and it's control over your own citizens. It's affecting the freedom of ordinary people, not just of outsiders. And it's prompting an interference with the legal process, which becomes an obstacle to the operations of the state. Now, many people want to say, look, yes, what we should do is fix the system, but not allow for these sort of things to happen. But the point I want to make here is that this, to use a fairly nerdy sort of terminology, this is not a bug, this is a feature. This is not something that, an upgrade is going to sort out. This is something that's permanently locked into the structure of this enterprise, which is to control people. If you control people, then you're going to have to survey, you're going to have to monitor, you're going to have to regulate. And since you still won't achieve your ends, you will see injustice. You will see these things happening. You can see it as a matter of economic logic. You can also see it in the history. Look at the history of any immigrant nation. The more seriously it's tried to control immigration, the more seriously it's infringed the rights of its own citizens. Well, someone might listen to all of this and say, well, it's okay, that seems plausible enough, but maybe it's just worth it anyway. Maybe we need to control immigration, even if it does cost us some of our freedom, because of the gains. And there are three kinds of arguments we can have here. One is the kind of economic argument that says, well, the economic benefits will be great enough to offset the loss of freedom. Another will be to say that there are cultural benefits, and these will offset the loss of freedom. Finally, there's the argument that says, well, self-determination is what's most important. And in order to be self-determined, we have to control immigration at our borders. Let me look at each of these arguments in turn. With the economic arguments, I think there are two aspects we should consider. One is the impact of immigration on wealth and income. And the second thing is the impact of immigration on the distribution of wealth. These are the only economic issues, but I'm just going to say something briefly about each of these. There is quite a bit of debate among economists about the impact of immigration. Very, very vigorous debate. The curious thing about this debate is that it's really a debate about whether immigration has a 0.9% positive influence or a 0.9% negative influence. That's the margin. We're not talking about arguments about people saying, no, immigration is going to economically crush us, and people who say, no, immigration is going to lead to a vast boom. It's not that margin. In a way, it's a bit like having an argument about the impact of women entering the workforce, which started happening in this way since the 1950s. If an economist spent his time now debating this question, he'll be regarded as a bit crazy. I'm saying he, because I doubt that women economists would want to spend any time on this. It just would not be regarded as a serious question. Yet economists are spending a lot of energy on this very question. Well, perhaps it's useful because there is a public debate about this, and that's disappeared when it comes to women in the workforce. But the take-home point here is that even if you think immigration has a negative consequence, the negative consequence is very small, almost immeasurably small. The range of error is significant enough that whatever your conclusions, they really compromise by the fact that there's no really significant story that you can tell. At least not in economic terms. So maybe the bigger question is the question of the impact of immigration on the distribution of wealth. And here there are many issues and arguments to consider, but I'll just focus on one, which is the claim that what immigration does is it harms the poor. Those who are wealthy, people such as ourselves, gain from immigration because we get cheaper labor, and that cheaper goods that come at cheaper labor. But the poor guy who's working on the factory floor, the agricultural laborer, well, he's the one who's going to have to compete with these people, and his wages are going to go down. That's the general argument. Now, once again, the evidence of this is not encouraging from the point of view of those who want to limit immigration. Of course, when anybody gets a job, somebody else misses out on it. So you can't deny that an immigrant coming in will take away some job that could have gone to someone who is local. But firstly, we have to ask, well, what is the impact of an immigrant coming in, or many immigrants coming in, on the nature of labor market? So one common observation is that, well, it all depends on what kind of immigrants come in. Are they immigrants who substitute labor, or are they immigrants who skill complement labor? If it's the latter, they create more jobs. If it's the former, then they displace people. But it's not easy to distinguish these two categories of people, because many people do a bit of both. So once again, it's very hard to show clearly that people are being displaced. But even to the extent that we can say that some people are displaced, we can't say whether this overall is to the disadvantage of all people who might be not being displaced. Because there are many people who would be displaced in employment if we restricted immigration. Because if we restricted, that will itself change the nature of the market and the demand for labor, and will affect local workers. If you, for example, limited trade, you said you've got to set up tariff barriers to stop so many imports. Well, the people you'll affect are all of those workers who work in companies that import cars, that repair imported cars, and so on. So the displacement argument, the distribution argument, is really one that at best shows that there's a very, very tiny number of people who are badly affected. You can't identify them very easily. Most of them, in the United States, for example, tend to be those who are at college dropout level of skill. And they tend to be the previous generation immigrants. They're the ones who are most affected. So the economic arguments on the whole don't seem to give a very strong reason for limiting our own freedom. We're not gaining it. We're losing our freedom, but economically, we're not benefiting. Indeed, no one is benefiting. Even if you take the case of, for example, an agricultural worker in Britain, you might say, look, there are all these Polish immigrants coming in, and as a result, wages in the agricultural sector have dropped. Well, sure, he's suffering loss in wages, but you can't assume that if you not imported any of this immigrant labor, that what will have happened is that his wages would have risen. They might have. Or that business might have said, well, look, we can't compete on the market with tomatoes which are picked at £10 an hour because we can't sell them, so we'll set up shop. We'll close that business. That worker now may not just suffer a loss of wages or of income, he may suffer the loss of the job. Not necessarily, in some cases yes, in some cases no, but you can't assume that just because you are facing competition and suffering a loss in wages, that is something that would be improved if you limited immigration. So the economic arguments, I think, are not compelling. What about the cultural argument? Here the argument is that we need to control immigration because we need to preserve our own society's traditions and values. We need to keep it kind of integrated society so that everybody feels attached to it and committed to it, and we share the same values. Now, it may depend a little bit on what kind of a country you're talking about. Now, maybe if you're talking about a country like Tibet, for example, where there's considerable homogeneity, maybe beside the of Chinese as a result of the takeover of Tibet in the late 1950s, they might have an argument here. But if you're talking about a modern liberal democracy, which is internally diverse, not only because of immigration, but because there are different sorts of people who've lived there for a long time, that's more problematic. Firstly, claims about cultural homogeneity are always much exaggerated. That's because they tend to be stronger when there is a kind of external enemy or problem. But once that goes, internal divisions always appear. People are different. They belong to different groups, they belong to different religions, they belong to different traditions, and there's some amount of tension in society all the time. To try to make the cultural character of a country a subject of political decision is a very dangerous thing to do. Because if you do that, then you run the risk immediately of any minority group being disaffected, because the definition that's going to be given is not one that they will be happy with. If you were to say that India is a Hindu nation, all the Muslims and the Buddhists and the Christians are going to be very troubled by this. Because it is a Hindu nation, but it's also a Muslim one, it's also a Buddhist one, it's also a Christian one. There are millions of all of these people. If you try to say that the national language must be Hindi, even if 70% of people speak it, it's going to be a problem for those 150 million Tamils, or the Gujaratis, or the Punjabis, who don't see this as the national language. In fact, many of them prefer that the national language be English. Not because they speak it better, but because it's, in some sense, it's not always, but in some sense it's neutral. If you want to push this issue of cultural unity, you will have to be prepared for internal conflict and strife. But there's another problem that then arises too from the point of view of politics. Let's say that what you want to do is you want to control your borders, control immigration, in order to preserve a kind of cultural integrity, preserve the existing cultural structure of your country. Well, there are two ways of controlling immigration as far as the entry of immigrants is concerned. One is you can do it by simply reducing the numbers. The other thing you can do is by selecting people. Now, if what you want to do is preserve cultural integrity, then make sure that things don't change. What you have to do is you have to select people from the right cultural backgrounds. You don't want people coming in from the wrong culture. Now, leave aside the whole issue of race and racism here. Many Western liberal democracies are worried about this, and they want to pursue a liberal, egalitarian policy that has no trust as racism. But if you're going to be selective, this is going to be much more difficult to sustain in accordance with your own conditions. But leave that aside for a moment. What you have to do is say to some of your citizens, look, I'm sorry, you can't invite your family back. You can't hire the sort of people that you want because we're trying to preserve cultural integrity. You're going to have to treat different groups and communities in your own country differently. You have to treat them unequally. Now, if you are a liberal democracy and you want to preserve equality before the law, this is the dilemma you will confront. But if you say, no, we're not going to be selective, we're just going to reduce the numbers. Well, this may not solve your problem either, because then if you're not selective, if people come in from different parts of the world and the balance changes, you may not preserve the kind of cultural integrity that you think you're going to preserve. You will have to be selective. And this, of course, is going to open up a whole range troubles within your own society. The more diverse it is already, the more difficult it's going to be to control immigration. What about the final argument? It says, well, okay, of course there is a loss of freedom, but we must nonetheless control our borders in the name of self-determination. What we have to do is control our own borders. Mrs. May said as much today in defending the decision for Britain to leave the European Union. We will control our own immigration. Well, that's fine. But now, what exactly does the self-determination amount to here? Because you could, of course, exercise your self-determination and say, we choose to have more immigration, less immigration control. That's still, of course, controlling your own immigration policy. You're doing so by having many fewer control, having borders that are more rather than less open, having less bureaucracy, having fewer regulations, having less monitoring. So you could choose that in the name of self-determination. But for some reason, people seem to think, at least those in government, that self-determination means closing the border. But it doesn't. Self-determination at best just means taking your own decisions politically. But the trouble is that if you go on that path to say, in the name of self-determination, we're going to restrict you, we're going to control citizens, we're going to control and monitor, survey everybody. It's hard to see why this is actually self-determination. What kind of self-determination is it if you put a fence around yourself, lock yourself in, and survey all your citizens? If this is self-determination, I think I'd rather be out of it. Self-determination is imprisoning yourself. This does not seem like the ideal form for a free society to take. And to say that there's self-determination really means, well, there's collective self-determination. But here what I want to say is collective self-determination really consonant with individual determination? Individual self-determination. Those who advocate self-determination should think again, what does the self refer to? Is there a collective self of the kind they're thinking? And does that really reflect what everybody individually thinks? I suggest not, because if you understand how democratic processes operate, it's about collective control are taken by national governments sensitive to the electoral process, worried about marginal seats, and inclined to pander to particular well-placed interests. And it is they who will take the decision. And the decision will, in the end, not be one that favors everybody. It will favor some over others. It favors some preferences over others. There are many people who want to have immigrants and more of them, just as there are many who want to have fewer of them. But what these are preferences to a large extent over the preferences of other people. Is this what self-determination amounts to? And if it is this really consonant with individual freedom? Is it consonant with any meaningful sense of self-determination at all? The Australian politician Forlin who came to notoriety about 20 years ago on a very, very strong anti-immigrant platform, set up the One Nation Party, galvanized an anti-immigrant, anti-minorities mentality. Famously said, Australia is my home. I should be able to decide who comes into my home. It was a very powerful metaphor, but I want to unpack that a little bit. Think about this question. Should you have the right to control who comes into your own home? Well, it depends on who's living there. If you're in a single flat on your own, I'd say, yep, you should have full control over who comes in. Maybe unless there's a fire needs to be controlled. Otherwise, That's for you. Now, if you're living as a married couple, should you have the right of veto over anyone coming in? You could. I think you meant for an unhappy marriage. But, you could have that rule. If you have children, you could say to the children, no, Daddy says who can and can't come in, and if I say no, that's it. No freedom. Be prepared for very, very grumbling children. But now, supposing you're not just talking about your own flat, your own family, you're talking about a condo, okay? It's a building with, let's say, 30 flats. Do you want to have a rule that says each individual has the right of veto over anybody inviting somebody else in? You could have that rule too. I think make it a very unpleasant place to live. It would be a condominium that now has to have border guards. It would have to have checks on your home. You would have to have intrusions to make sure you aren't harboring a visitor without everybody else's permission. You need a bureaucracy. Now imagine we're not talking about a condo, but a neighborhood, or a city, or a province, or a state. Well, my point is, the more you want to say, the crucial thing is I have the right to decide who comes into my home, the more you have to want to. Well, what kind of right are you talking about? Do you really think that you should have a veto? Or that some subgroup should have a veto? Is this a nice kind of a society to build? There's a famous article by Canadian theorist and Joseph Cairns. He's a great defender of open borders. And in his paper, he begins with a very dramatic open line. Borders have guards, and guards have guns. He's trying to make the point that immigration control is about the exercise of violence. I think that's a very important point, except that it needs to be qualified, or at least deconstructed a little bit. My point is that the guards aren't at the border. They're at the border, of course. They're also overseas at other checkpoints, whether it's in Calais or whether it's in the offices of the countries where people might visit. And they're also internal. Not only patrolmen well inside the border between the US and Mexico, but there are patrolmen in the cities and in the towns checking on people. Immigration control does mean guards, does mean guns. But a lot of the time, I'm trying to say, those guns aren't pointed outwards, they're pointed in. And that's why I'm concerned about the impact of immigration on our faith. Thank you.
Really, thanks.